Hello, welcome to the third video in the Android Fragments series. Here in part 3, we're going to implement fragment communication. We're going to add that to the blood pressure app. If you recall from the second video, we implemented dynamic code fragments. That is, we changed the layout fragment tags to frame layout placeholders, and then we replaced fragments into those placeholders from our Java code. Here we're going to have the blood pressure app actually fill in the follow-up recommendation, which we left blank because we didn't have a way of communicating the input in the input fragment to the output fragment, and that's what we're going to address today. At a high level, we can look at it with the following diagram. The way this works is the calling fragment, which is our input fragment, is going to call up to the hosting activity, which is our main activity, and it's going to pass the category number, which is based on the blood pressure values that were entered by the user. We're going to determine what the category is based on those numbers, and then we're going to pass that up into the main activity, which will then call down into the call fragment, our output fragment. The Java mechanism that we're going to use to make this happen is the nested interface. We're going to define a nested interface in the input fragment, and we're going to then create a reference to that interface, assign the main activity to that interface reference, and then we're going to call into that main activity, which implements the interface. In the main activity, we're going to implement that interface. We're going to write that method that's going to be called by the calling fragment, which in turn calls down into the output fragment. And the output fragment will have a method that will be called by the main activity's interface method. Okay, we'll see. This should become clearer as we implement, as we go through the code here. Let's get back to the code. All right, so there are 4 things that we need to do to the calling fragment, and that calling fragment is our input fragment. And the first thing we have to do is we have to define our interface. A nested interface is public by default, and it's also static. So any other class can implement this interface as long as it provides the qualifying name of the class that contains the interface. In this case, it's input fragment. We're going to call this fragment, or this interface rather, we're going to call it display recommendation. And we're going to specify the method of this interface, the only method that is in this interface. going to just call it display recommendation as well. It takes a single argument, an integer, category number. If you recall from your Java studies, an interface is like a class, except there are no method implementations. They are just method declarations. Another class will implement this interface by defining the member methods. The second thing we need to do here is we need to create an instance variable which is a reference to the class that implements this interface. There we go. And we're just going to call this mDisplay recommendation. The third thing that we have to now do is we have to initialize the reference to the class that implements the interface. And what we'll do is we're going to do this in a method called onAttach. onAttach is a callback, an override method that gets called when the fragment is attached to its hosting activity. Now, what gets passed into this method, into onAttach, is a reference to a context. A context is a base class of an activity. So a reference to the activity is passed into this method. And so we're going to add this override using our trusty Android Studio pop-up menu here. We're going to select override methods, and I'm going to search for onAttach. We see 3 here. We're going to take the second one. These methods with the strikeout that are struck out, these are deprecated and you shouldn't use them. But the one that we want to use is the second one here with this context parameter. And it is now added to our fragment. And what we're going to do here is we're going to take the parameter that is being passed in the context, and we're going to assign it to this variable. First, though, we have to test. We have to make sure that the activity that's being passed in does indeed implement the interface. And so we're going to test for that with the instance of operator. If the context is indeed an instance of display recommendation, which means that the context, the activity, implements display recommendation, we can then assign to mDisplay recommendation. We do have to cast it. If it is not an instance of display recommendation, if the activity doesn't implement the interface, we're just going to throw an exception. We're going to throw a class cast exception. And its only argument is a string, an error message. All right, that's the third step that we need to do, the modification that we need to make to the fragment. And the last modification is we need to call into the interface class, the activity, we need to call the interface method, the display recommendation method. And the place where we're going to do that is where we previously edited or updated the the follow-up text, the recommendation text, and that was right here. In fact, we have it commented out from the main activity. And so what we're going to do is we're going to call into the main activity from here. And the way we do that is we're just going to say display recommendation, and we're going to pass in M category. And that is the fourth modification, the fourth and the last modification that we need to make to input fragment. Let's save this off. Okay. Now we need to modify the main activity. We need to make the main activity implement this interface that we created in the input fragment. And the way we do that is we're going to make two modifications. The first modification is to the declaration line of the activity class. We're going to type in implements display recommendation, which is right here. Notice that Android Studio adds the scope prefix here, the class name, and that's the first modification. The second modification that we need to make is we need to define that method. And you'll notice that Android Studio is flagging our line here where we made the modification, saying that it's essentially telling us that we need to implement the methods in the interface. And since there's only one method in the interface, there's only one method that we need to implement. And if we just click on this line, actually, I'm sorry, we click on the line, we've got to make that, there is what is known as an intention, which appeared briefly, and there it is. This light bulb that you occasionally will see to the left in your editor window is called an intention, and this will help you with errors and other issues that come up in your source code. This intention will actually help us implement the interface activities. I just clicked on the down arrow here, and in the pop-up menu we see implement methods, so we're going to click on that, and it's going to display a list of optional methods to implement, and we're going to implement the method of our interface, which is display recommendation. So I'm going to double click on that, and sure enough, it inserts the method that we need to implement. Okay, now this method is going to this is the method that gets called from the input fragment. It gets called here in our diagnose button listener. Once that button is clicked, the code gets the values from the input strings. It then looks up the category. It gets that from the model class, the blood pressure model class, and then from that category, it indexes into those string arrays to insert the category text into that category field. It then calls up into the main activity with the category number. Okay, and here, this is what's going to get called. And here we're going to call down into the output fragment. We need to reference the output fragment here. A couple of ways that it could be done. One of the ways is I could have created an instance variable reference to the output fragment and assigned to it in onCreate. That would have kind of tied these two methods together a little bit tightly, and we certainly want to minimize coupling within our code. And so what we'll do is we'll just retrieve the output fragment from the fragment manager. So the way we'll do that is I'm going to declare a local variable called output fragment, and it is going to get the output fragment from the support fragment manager. I'm going to call get fragment by ID, and we're going to enter in the ID of the placeholder tag in the layout, in the main activity layout, and that is going to be fragment output. Well, we call it output fragment. There we go. We call it output fragment here. It may be called, you know what? It is called fragment output in the previous videos. Use fragment output. This code was built. This particular version of the code was built separate from the code that I edited in those previous two videos. So it's fragment output for you. All right, now that we have the output fragment, we are going to call into the output fragment, we're going to call a method called display recommendation. We're going to pass it in the category value that was passed in to this method. Now notice that display recommendation is flagged, and it is flagged as an error because we haven't implemented it yet in the output fragment. Notice that there's an intention to the left. Let's see if the intention will help us, and it will. It will create a display recommendation method for us in the output class. I click on that, it opens up the output fragment source file, and it inserts a display recommendation method here. All right, and what we're going to do in this method is simply look up the string. We're going to do what we did in the original activity, and that is we can look at it right here in on create G. We're basically going to do this, and in fact we could just copy it. We can copy it and paste it right there, or we can just type it in. And you know, why don't we type it in? I think that would be much better. So let's type in M follow-up text view and set text, and then we're going to look up the category. Oh, sorry, we're going to reference M recommendations, and we're going to use the category as the index, and that is all that we need to do. And we should see the recommendation displayed in the app when we run it. We have no errors, and so let's just go ahead and run this. Okay, so let's enter in some values here. Let's enter in, let's say 126 and 88, and voila, we have our recommendation displayed here. Let's see if it works on rotation, and it didn't work on rotation. Well, what happened? Here's what happened. We did not put in any provisions for restoring the value of the widgets of the text fields on rotation, the way we did in the input fragment. In the input fragment, we overrode the save unsave instant state callback, And then we also checked for the presence of a bundle that is passed into onCreateView, which, in onSave instance state, we saved the data, and then we restored it in onCreateView if, in fact, there was a bundle. We didn't do that in the output fragment, so we lost our data. Now, we could do this. We could implement onSave instance state, but there's a simpler way to do this with text fields, with text views and edit text fields. And the way to do that in a very, very simple way is we can click on the layout, the landscape layout, click on our output fragment, we click on the output fragment, and we then click on the field that we want to preserve across rotation. We'll click on all attributes, and if we scroll down to the attribute freezes text right here, if we click on that, make sure that it's checked, not with a black square in it, make sure it's checked. Now if we save this and run it, our recommendation text should be preserved across rotation without implementing this onSave instance state. OnSave instance state is, what I just suggested to you is appropriate for text fields. But best practice is to use OnSave instance state, because in some of your apps, or probably most of your apps, you're going to have more complex user interfaces, and there's going to be more things that you're going to need to preserve. You might have some things you need to calculate. You can't do that with a freezes text attribute. You need to have a method where you can do the necessary calculations and updates to various widgets that aren't just text-based. So let's see if our freezes text modification works, and let's add one. Let's add our systolic value, and then we'll add a diastolic value, and we see our output there, and let's see if our output is preserved on rotation. And sure enough, it is. The freezes text attribute worked. It preserved our text view contents across rotation. One last comment about fragments, and that is when you are using fragments in a linear layout, you may need to make some adjustments between the width, if you're using a horizontal linear layout, and the layout weight. And so for example, if you for example wrap content, if you have both of your layout widths wrap content, like so, they look pretty good here, but when you run this, you might see something like the following. We're going to see an anomaly in the display. Let's see, let's put in 125 and 88. Okay, and when we rotate, you're going to see this. You're going to see this kind of, the first fragment is scrunched up. All right. That's obviously not something we want, and we didn't get that when the layout width was match parent. Let's get this correct. There we go. We didn't get that. Now we could fix that by making this match parent, but you know, maybe match parent on the width doesn't make much sense because we only want to go halfway across. If we want to make sure that two fragments or two widgets of any view shares the width or the height of a linear layout, the way to do it is to, instead of wrapping content, making this zero dip. And you have to make them both 0. And that will cause the two to share the width or the height if it's a vertical linear layout on the display. So let's just run this. Let's straighten it out here initially. The layout weight has to be 1 in either case. And there you get that nice, you know, even, you know, dispersion of the two views, of the two fragments there. Let's try it with 85 and 25. We'll get the, yeah, this has a slightly longer follow-up recommendation. Yeah, and so we get that nice look. So you can either use 0dp or match parent, but 0dp is probably more correct. And that's it for the third video. For the homework, I want to see an implementation of the blood pressure app that implements code fragments and fragment communication, essentially what we've done here in videos 2 and 3, and add your own you know, modification, your unique modifications. It can be merely cosmetic. It can be some color or font change or combination. And that's it. Thanks for watching, and see you in class.